right, friends, let's make some wine now. When we left off in the vineyard, we had a bunch of grapes that were about ready to be picked. Let's get those grapes off the vine, get them into the winery, and see what else needs to be done to get that juice out of those grapes and get them ready to be made into wine. So this is a talk on preparing the grapes for fermentation. And this is going to include harvesting those grapes. When are we going to pick the grapes? How are we going to pick those grapes? Sorting of the grapes, crushing of the grapes, destemming of the grapes, pressing of the grapes, all in a concerted effort to get the juice out of those grapes and make something called a fermentable juice and or must, a term that we'll end with and pick up in the next lecture. So back in the vineyard, we talked about all of the thoughts that go into the harvest season. When are we going to pick? The whites come to ripeness and therefore get harvested before the reds in general. Light-skinned reds get harvested, come to ripeness and get harvested before dark-skinned reds. And so we're always out there thinking about the climate, how sunny was it, how much sugars we got accumulated. And of course, the harvest season in the northern hemisphere is different than the southern hemisphere. And the winemaker and the viticulturist and maybe the whole family, if it's a family-run operation, is out there in the fields looking at the sugars and the is measured by Brix, and the acids and the pH balance and the phenolics, these little molecules that in parts per million affect the finished flavors and aromas of the grape juice and therefore the wine, and the ripeness level itself of those grapes, how hard or how soft is the berry, how much liquid comes out when we squeeze it, how easy does the seed get separated from the pulp when we squeeze it, if we chew up the skins in our mouths, how tannic does it taste, and all of these considerations, of course, they're thinking about, and what's the weather? Is it going to rain tomorrow? Is a hurricane coming next week? We would ultimately like to leave our berries on the vine until we get them exactly right, the way we want them for that particular wine, but weather may push us to do otherwise. So, this is stuff we've already talked about. Let's now get to the point of, okay, we got it. Whatever it is. Pinot Grigio, that's a light-skinned white grape. It probably is one of the first to come to ripeness, one of the first things to be harvested if you have that, and then maybe you do Chardonnay in a couple weeks, and then maybe you do Pinot Noir a couple weeks after that, and then you do Cabernet Sauvignon a month after that. But we got our Pinot Grigio, let's do it! Tomorrow's the big day! Okay, so when actually tomorrow are we going to harvest? Well, pretty much, and I could be wrong, go talk to winemakers, viticulturalists. Pretty much, folks want to harvest their grapes out of the vineyard in the early morning, as early as possible. Maybe even pre-dawn. Maybe in the middle of the night if you got tractors with, lights on them. Why would that be? Well, right before the sun comes up is typically the coldest time of the day. Really any season, summer, spring, winter, fall. That's barring that you have a huge cold front sweeping through the nation on a certain day, but on any average day, it's darkest just before dawn, and it's coldest just before dawn, and that's because you've had the longest amount of time that the sun has gone away and is not pushing solar radiation onto the earth that heats it up. So you want the coolest time of the day to go in and your Pinot Grigio vineyard and pull all those grapes out. Why? Is it because you just want cooler conditions so that your workers aren't working in the middle of the hot summer day and they get all hot and sweaty? No! Workers work and workers sweat. That's why they pay the money. We don't care about the workers. It's all about the grapes. And consider that this bunch of grapes is part of a living system. When it's still stuck on the vine's connected to the roots, and it's part of a living organism. The second, the harvesters go in there and cut that off, now it's dead. And you now have a dead bunch of grapes. They're only going to go downhill from now. You've cut the life support to them. If you just drop them on the ground, you know what would happen in a day, 2 days, a week. They'll rot right before your eyes. They'll rot pretty quickly. We don't want any of this microbiological activity interfering with our grapes, which is why we pick during the coolest time of the day, when microbiological activity is at its minimum. It's at its slowest. And in fact, if you want to stop microbiological activity in your own kitchen, you just cut something open or you're doing this and you're like, oh, I don't want this to spoil. What do? You stick it in the refrigerator where it's cold. Cold retards microbiological activity. What microbiological activity? There's stuff all over the place, man. Critters, microbes are everywhere, all around us right now, wherever you're watching this, and there's even more in the vineyard. I shouldn't say more. There's equal numbers of microbes everywhere, I suppose. But I've already pointed out that if you pick up any dark-skinned grape or any white-skinned grape, go to the grocery store and you look at it, zoom in right there, you see that white film on it. That's actually wild yeast. So you actually already have a microbe sitting on the grapes while they're in the vineyard that's ready to go. And they get any chance to get through the skin, they'll start fermenting, they'll start eating that sugar and turning it into alcohol right on the spot while the while the bunch is still hanging out there. That's just yeast. You also have molds and fungus that are in vineyards that operators have to deal with all the time. They're floating around. You have viruses floating around. You have bacteria floating around. So all of these microbes in tandem want to attack your grapes before you get them turned into wine, and the winemaker does not want that. Particularly even just Acetobacter or other bacteria that oxidize fruit. So, you know, the fruit, you're picking the fruit and you're throwing it into a bin. It starts to smash up a little bit. Oxygen gets in there, bacteria gets in there, and it starts to brown things. In fact, you can do this yourself. Take an apple and cut it in half and put it on your kitchen counter, a banana. What happens in like an hour or two? It starts to turn brown. That's microbiological activity and oxidation. You don't want that in your fruit. So, cut the stuff off the vine, put it in bins, and get it to the get it to the winery as quickly as possible, okay? That's when we want to harvest. How are we gonna harvest? Well, you're probably like, what are you talking about, Boyer? Of course we know how to harvest. It's people out there with scissors and shears chopping these bunches of grapes off the vine. Yes, that's a very popular concept. That's how we think that almost all fruit is picked. As humans are out there picking fruit, and like most humans, you'd be completely wrong in that assessment, but that's okay because there's also mechanical ways to harvest fruit, grapes in particular for our little lecture here, but let's take them one at a time. What's the benefits and the downsides of hand picking, which seems like the classic, great, nice, old school way to do it? Well, the main advantage of human hand picking is that humans are pretty smart. Even the dumb ones. I know that sounds surprising, but even dumb people, if you say, hey, I can teach you in 5 minutes what good grapes look like and what bad grapes look like, only take the good ones, they'll figure it out really quick. And the more you do this assessment, fruit assessment, the better you get at it. So the main advantage of humans is knowledge, wisdom, and discernment that human workers can bring to the fields where they pick only the healthiest bunches of grapes. They'll pick ripe bunches of grapes and won't pick underripe bunches of grapes. They'll pick nice looking fruit, not fruit that's rotting already on the vine, that's being attacked by a fungus or a mold. So it's that human component. It's like, they can get the best stuff. Humans are also really versatile in that they can work on really any terrain. So they can work on flat terrain and pick grapes. Or in Germany, where you have like 20-degree slopes, they can climb up with ropes and cut the bunches of grapes down and drag them down the mountain in baskets. Machines ain't so good at tough terrain. Humans are. The main other thing that humans are really good at is removal of M.O.G. And I don't even know if that's how you pronounce it. M.O.G. It's an acronym. M.O.G. M.O.G. is material other than grape. Material other than grape. Like what? What material other than grape? Everything but the actual fruit itself. So leaves in particular, but other woody stems that may be sticking down, grass that's grown up into a bird's nest, bee's nest, junk critters, whatever. You don't want that stuff in your juice, which is going to be turned into wine. It can throw in all kinds of off flavors. So a hand harvester can look at stuff, and as they're doing it, they're grabbing the fruit and pulling out stuff that ain't fruit. Even when the boss man is sitting there and other people are picking, the boss man can go over to the bins and literally, just while smoking a cigarette, be picking out leaves and stems and stuff. It's little things like that that produce perhaps the best quality juice because you're choosing the best quality grapes to go into that juice and excluding as much as possible. Now, what are the downsides? Well, humans are expensive. Humans want to be paid, they want money, and they don't work cheap. Even when you underpay them, it still adds up to a lot because it may take a team of 20 or 30 pickers to cover a significant amount of acreage, and it takes time. It's not a very fast process. Having said that, what you've been watching is a time lapse of an entire row, like a 200-foot row of Petit Verdot being harvested out of Veritas vineyards during the 2016 harvest. And they did it in like 15 or 20 minutes. I mean, if you have a seasoned group of folks that know how to harvest, they just fly. And you can't imagine when you watch them, you're like, holy cow, it's such a well-oiled machine. It's like boom, 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 and all of a sudden, all them grapes are gone. It looks like it's really fast, right? As an outsider, but trust me, it's nowhere near as fast as a machine. And now let's turn to mechanical harvesting. Now, mechanical harvesting grapes is just that. It's a machine doing it. It's a tractor. It's this specialized tractor that it looks like a big kind of, looks like a big H. Right? It's a tractor with long legs. And it's got these long legs because it actually sits above the vineyard row and goes over it. It straddles it, and it has these plastic beater bars, and that's what they're called. I call them wiffle ball bats, that literally, as they're going over the vine, just go whack, 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 bam, 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 beat the hell out of the whole plant. And in doing so, it also has a conveyor belt underneath that's catching all the shit that's falling down. I shouldn't say shit, it's grapes. But as you imagine, if you're indiscriminately beating the vine, then leaves and old canes and birds' nests and bees' nests are also falling into that. So you don't have any sorting process. And unripe fruit and ripe fruit is going in there, and rotten fruit and not rotten fruit. So it doesn't have that element of discernment. But boy, is it cheap, because it only takes a team of 5 to 8 to run one of these machines, and machines don't get tired. They can go all night. In fact, they can harvest in the middle of the night when it's the coolest with the lowest amount of microbiological activity. So it's cheaper, way cheaper, and it's faster. And that also comes into play when you're thinking about what I've already taught you about what people are considering in the vineyard prior to harvest. Weather. If you know that, oh my God, a hurricane's suddenly going to slam into us like 2 days from now, or even maybe tomorrow, if you rely solely on hand picking, you're screwed. Unless you can suddenly double your workforce and get out in the fields before dawn, you're going to lose fruit. With a mechanical harvester, you say, well, you got 24 hours. They'd be like, okay, we're working all night. And they can clear vast acreages in a short amount of time with a small amount of people. Now, again, it doesn't seem traditional. It doesn't seem classical. But it is kind of the way of today and certainly of the future, because mechanical harvesting of grapes has been one of the major changes in vineyard operations for the last 50, 60, 70 years. They weren't even introduced until the 1960s. Somebody, probably an Italian, built these. The Italians build everything cool. So I don't know who started building mechanical harvesters, but they weren't even introduced or tried till the 1960s, which ain't that terribly a long time ago. And even then, nobody really adopted them. Just like the screw cap. It's a really good technology, but people are like, but that's not traditional. I don't like that. You're beating up the fruit too much and all this other stuff. However, they have been widely adopted across virtually all planet Earth, especially in big wine-producing areas like California, U.S. in general, Australia, now even France. So I hate to say this because I don't have hard numbers, but you should go ahead and understand. The majority of wine grapes on planet Earth are now harvested mechanically. And it actually could be the vast majority of wine grapes on planet Earth are harvested mechanically. But they don't really advertise that because, again, it doesn't seem so organic or traditional or what have you. Do bank on this. Medium range and high-end fine wines, yeah, they're probably still hand-picked. Expensive wines, probably still hand-picked. Small-scale vineyard operation, probably still hand-picked. Again, just like any farm implement. If you have a small farm, it's not worth it to you to buy this big piece of equipment. You will absorb the labor cost and pass it on to the consumer through the price of the bottle of wine. But bulk wines, yeah, they're all mechanically harvested. Every single grape mechanically harvested. And for those fine wine producers and those traditionalists that say, I don't like mechanical harvesting, there are some downsides, and here they are, as I've started to point out. They only can work on level land, so you can rule most of Germany out. I don't think they do a lot of mechanical harvesting on a hill because the damn tractor would just fall over on a 20% slope. But more importantly, mechanical harvesters can't differentiate between ripe and unripe fruit, between rotten and not rotten fruit. They also, because of the process itself, you think about, you're literally beating the damn plant. you have the possibility, if not the probability, to damage fruit. So you're already smacking fruit in the vineyard before you even get to the winery. So maybe you're busting open the skins and bruising it, and again, starting to oxidize and getting bacteria in there. You also aren't sorting out M.O.G, so you have unwanted fruit breakage, unwanted juice spillage, unwanted oxidation, unwanted fermentation, unwanted maceration, and that's when the juice mixes with the skins and pulls out color. And you're going to lose some of that because you're sloshing the stuff around in buckets. You haven't even got it to the winery yet. And of course, you have no control over the M.O.G, so you also have all this other junk that could be floating in there that's going to have to either be sorted out later or not sorted out later. So that's the argument for fine wine, saying, no, we don't use mechanical harvesting. I will only defend mechanical harvesting at one point, which is a couple points, which is it is cost prohibitive for labor when it comes to hand picking. If you have a really big vineyard, it's a lot of money. And so some vineyards would say, hey, look, we can save so much money by mechanically harvesting versus hand picking that we can take those savings and spend them on sorting of the grapes, picking out the M.O.G, or perhaps we can save all this money, we can buy better barrels or more new barrels. So using the savings to make a better wine, that's a decent argument. But also, these machines have gotten a lot better since the 1960s. So a lot of the fruit bruising, they've made them better, like all technologies. And I'm explaining how they're literally beating the fruit off the vine with a bat. They're not actually hitting the fruit. They're trying to hit the canes above it. And at this point in the harvest, the stalks and canes are a little are dying and they're dried out. So they can actually now kind of break those canes without damaging the fruit as much as you might think. So it is what it is, and you probably can't taste the difference in the bottle when all's said and done, but it's a tradition to do it the old school way, and fine wines would say, and there's something to it, our stuff is better because we're paying more attention. At every step of the process I'm talking about, even in this part of the lecture, by the way, the more attention to detail that's paid, the better the grapes, the better the juice, the better the finished wine, and that's why you're going to pay more money for certain wines that do a lot of this attention to detail. But in either case, okay, harvesting, whether it's humans or machines, are going to stack it into bins, and they stack it into bins that are about yay high. You may have seen these yellow bins. They're all over every winery you've ever been to, or out in the fields, or even in wine movies you've seen. And they're stackable bins, and that's because you really don't want to pull all the grapes off of one huge vineyard and throw them all in one big dump truck. Because the weight of themselves, these suckers are not light, and you start to stack them 10 feet high, the weight is simply will be pressing down and smashing the ones at the bottom. So you put them in these crates that are then stackable, right? So you're trying to minimize the crushing until you get it into the winery and you're controlling it. And that's what we're going to do. Load it up into bins or load it up into a dump truck, either way. Get it to the winery as quickly as possible. Now, in the heat of the moment, let's say it's a harvest season where it was a really good season and a whole lot of stuff is suddenly ripe, and there's a hurricane coming in 2 or 3 days. So we just want to pull that fruit, pull it. You may get to a point that it's like, we can't process it all. All the other steps that I'm talking about from henceforth, you have to do to make wine, but you may not do them immediately. You do want to get the fruit out of the vineyard as quickly as possible and quietly as possible and microbiologically calmly as possible when the fruit is where you want it. You may not be able to process it all, though, if you have too much fruit coming in. So you can actually refrigerate it, okay? Stick it into a big refrigerator, reefer flats they call them. And you may see refrigerated trucks hanging out at vineyards at different points of the harvest season to hold on and chill down the overflow as they can get to processing them. And now let's get to the next steps of processing them. Once you get those grapes in there, assuming that they're not being refrigerated right this second, you're going to sort them, or you may or may not sort them, I should say. And sorting is that you have these bins of grapes, maybe now dumped into a bigger vat, and maybe that vat is then dumped into a conveyor belt, and it's going to be run across sorting tables. And you may have, at different wineries, 1, 2, or 3 sorts through the fruit itself before we do anything else. What are we sorting for? We're back to the M.O.G. Pulling out all that material other than grape. And most of this, again, is done by humans, by hand. You just have people looking at a conveyor belt of fruit going by and pulling out leaves, pulling out stems, pulling out that wasp nest, pulling out those dead bugs. Get the debris, the dirt, all that stuff out of there that was unintentionally harvested. And it's at this point, even if you mechanically harvest, you could now do a sort at the vineyard are at the winery and pull out as much of this stuff as possible. Now, for white and red grapes, a basic sort may happen to the whole clusters. So this whole gigantic thing is either one of these. There's just piles of these things going on the conveyor belt, and you may eye it in and be like pulling out the leaves or saying, oh, no, they accidentally got that bunch. Is just, you may pick up this bunch and be like, oh, no, this side is rotten. You clip off the rotten stuff, put the good stuff back in. And again, how many times you want to do this? Once, twice? It depends on the winery. If you are a bulk wine producer, you may not sort it all. Who cares? We're harvesting mega tons of fruit. Who cares if there's a spare dead bird or wasp nest in there? Grind it all up because we're making bulk wine. They're actually banking on the fact that they're going to get so much juice that it's going to drown out the imperfections that M.O.G crap that they didn't pull out will accidentally introduce. So like, ow, so what? There's some stalks and leaves and bushes and trees, whatever. We're making an ocean of $5 California Cabernet Sauvignon. You ain't going to taste that crap that accidentally got in there. And that's why, if you start to think about it, that's why you can have a $5 California Cabernet Sauvignon and a $50 California Cabernet Sauvignon. Right here at the sorting table, you're starting to add more value if you're going to sort through it and get a finer and finer group of grapes versus a bulk wine. Make sense? That's why you can get a $5 Australian Shiraz shipped from halfway across the planet to you. It's like, how on earth does Yellowtail pull a profit? Bulk, baby, bulk. Mechanical harvesting, no sorting, crush it all up and run, including all the crap you don't want in there. So you may do your initial sort. If you do sorts, you do your initial sorts on the whole clusters, okay? With whites, that's usually all you do. For refined red wines, and again, the more and more refined you want your finished wine, the more sorts you'll do. For refined reds, you actually will probably do another sort with individual berries after you do the crushing and destemming process. So they'll actually have a whole, it looks like a big slushy line, because as you're crushing the grapes and moving it, this whole time all this is happening because stuff is getting, grapes are getting stacked up in bins and dumped over here and thrown into a crusher and put on a hopper. So grape skins are breaking and juice is going all over the place, and they'll actually have collection trays underneath these conveyor belts that are sorting this. Juice is just everywhere, and you don't let it drip on the floor. You collect it all because that's what you're trying to get. But in this kind of slushy of busted up grapes and stuff, when it comes to red wines, you may do another sort where it's individual berry sort as the stuff's coming down the line and pulling out any remaining leaves or even bad fruit that you say you're find, or stalks or stems or anything like that. Again, the more and more you refine it, the more expensive the wine will typically be. At least it should be nicer, taste better. But if it's a bulk wine, who cares? Throw it all in. Now, whether we've sorted once, twice, or 3 times a lady, or never at all, we need to get the juice flowing out of that berry. It's the juice we want, not everything else that we've been intentionally trying to pick out up to this point with this sorting process. So let's proceed on now to crush those berries. And I'm going to give you 3 terms here. They're kind of all related. They're all part of a same process of how we get the juice out of the grape. And that is, we're going to crush them, we're going to destem them, and we're going to press them. But we're not necessarily going to do all of these things at the same times for white wines versus red wines. And just crushing and pressing may sound like the same thing to you, but it's not when you're working in the vineyard or in the winery. So just a quick vocabulary guide here. When we say we're going to crush the fruit, we're going to crush berries, what we're talking about is actually breaking the skin. Just breaking the skin. Just applying enough pressure or some sort of mechanical device that it scuffs the grape, pops it, not squeezes it, but pops it, right? And therefore juice will start to flow. Destemming is taking this and removing all the berries until this is left, and that's the stem or stalk. You want to chunk that out. Pressing is when you take those crushed berries and now start to apply some serious pressure to squeeze the juice out. Got it? Okay. Now, back in the good old days, perhaps all this was done simultaneously. And when I'm talking about crushing and destemming, or crushing and pressing, how do we get juice out of grapes? You may have this classic kind of historical image in your head of short-skirted, buxom women standing arm in arm, smashing grapes with their naked feet. Yeah, that was, there's something to that. It's not done really in today's world, but historically, the women stomping grapes with their bare legs and in buckets or big concrete vats? Yeah, people have been doing that for thousands of years. It's terribly effective. It's very effective. Why would that be so effective? And by the way, this isn't something that you find in today's world too much outside of Portugal. Portugal, the traditional way of making port wine is truly big concrete bunkers as big as a room with teams of people in sync, marching, treading to smash the grapes. They're doing it all at the same time. They're breaking the skins, they're smashing out the juice, and as they're doing it, the stalks and stems are coming up to the surface, and they're doing this knee-high or waist-high, and they pull these things out and throw them out. So they're doing it all at one time. Outside of Portugal, no, you're not going to see this anymore, not unless you go to some like touristy event at a winery where they're like, let's go stomp grapes and have a competition. Remind me to put this link to a hilarious woman reporter who tried to do this one time. So anyway, why is it that, from ancient times, 10,000 years ago, up to Egyptian times, 5,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, there are frescoes inside of Egyptian tombs that show the whole winemaking process, including people treading on grapes in a big vat. And even Minoan civilization, huge presses and people doing it, but also more mechanical presses that were used even 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. What's so great about the human foot? Just this, and I'm going to continue to come back to this. When we're trying to extract the juice, we want to get as much of the sugar out, because we want as much of the juice out as possible because it has the sugar, but we also want some of those flavors from the skin for certain types of wine, so we kind of want the skins to hang out there. We want to smash them up a little bit too, but we don't want to smash this stuff too much, and we definitely don't want to smash the seeds. Now this is true even in today's world, okay? So what's so great about the human foot? Well, the human foot is so perfectly suited for juice extraction because it's strong enough to break the skin of a grape. It's strong enough to smash all the juice out of a grape. It's not strong enough to break the seeds of a grape. So you can stomp and stomp and stomp and jump up and down and stomp and stomp and stomp all day long, and you'll get maximum amount of juice extraction, but the human foot can't break those seeds. Now, why would that be though? Why are we so troubled by seeds? Seeds of fruit, particularly grape, and even apples, even worse, they contain high amounts of intense bitterness, be it from tannins or other chemicals that are in seeds, again, in extremely high amounts. So try this sometime. Just go chew up a grape seed. It's woody and bitter. Better yet, do it to an apple seed. That same apple you cut in half and put on the counter to watch it oxidize, take the seeds out. Apple seeds actually have cyanide in them. They have intense bitterness, and cyanide, yeah, cyanide, like poison, so don't eat too many of them. But yeah, if you bust up and grind up seeds and get that stuff in your wine, intense bitterness that will wildly affect your finished wine way down the road. You can't get rid of it once you've got it in there, so you don't want to break the seeds. Okay, but that was then, this is now. How do we now get juice out without breaking up the seeds and possibly getting rid of these as well, depending on what type of wine you want to make? Today's world, we use mechanical devices for crushing. Some of them are called crushers. Some of them are called destemmers. Some of them are called crusher-destemmers. It's one machine that does both of those initial jobs in one. And these things are kind of cool looking. It kind of looks like a big stainless steel hopper with a big, huge screw at the bottom of it. So imagine like a big funnel, and you're piling in the grapes with a pitchfork. And now, just from the mere action of piling on grapes on top of grapes on top of grapes, you're already starting to crush them naturally with throwing them into a bin, and the weight of them on top of each other, they're naturally crushing themselves. And then as they run through this big screw type device that's applying just enough pressure as they siphon through to squish them just enough to crush open the skins. But also, as the screw is turning, it's pulling the berries off the vine, so it off the stalk, so it turns from this, and you're left with that. Okay? Now that's the way it happens for most whites initially. Okay? And most reds initially too, but we should pull out some nuances here, because we don't necessarily crush and destem white and red grapes equally. Again, the crusher just exerts enough pressure to break the skin of the grapes to get the juice flowing. And again, gravity is already starting to take over here as well. The destemmer removes the stems. Now, for most reds, crushing and destemming happens when they get to the winery. The skins on red grapes are the important part. And I'm getting ahead of myself. We're going to talk more about this in the next lecture. But when it comes to making red wine, as you well know by this point, I hope in the semester, whether you have a red grape, a black grape, a red grape, a pink grape, or a green grape, or a white grape, when you squeeze these suckers, the juice that comes out is all clear, right? It's all clear. So how do we make red wine? It's all about the skins. So with red wine production, with red grapes, we're mostly focused on getting the juice out, but saving the skins to hang out there with the juice, right? They adds the tannic structure, but a whole bunch of other flavors and all of the colors. Red grapes, black grapes, typically have already enough tannic structure to add to the wine. If you leave them on the stem and stalk, this sucker, like the seeds, also has a bunch of tannic component and bitterness, but also vegetal flavors and character. So if you were to completely annihilate, crush up, and destroy this, which you could do with a human foot eventually, and you could do with a press, you're going to add too much additional vegetal, leafy, greeny, black tea, green pepper, tannic components and flavors that are undesirable. The skin has everything you want for red wine. We don't need any more from this. And of course the seeds are out no matter what, okay? However, having said that, there's always exceptions. This isn't a zero-sum game. And some winemakers, depending on the grape variety and how good of a season they had, they may leave some of these in there. Some, maybe not all, but some, they may integrate in stems or leave some of the black grapes or red grapes on the stem. And I'll pick on Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir is a lighter skinned grape, and in a bad year, let's say it was not a really good harvest season, it was a short growing season, they didn't get to full ripeness, so they even have less color than usual, which means they're gonna have less tannic component than usual. A winemaker can say, oh, well, I'm making red wine, yeah, and I usually pull all these suckers out, but these Pinot Noir grapes are lacking in tannic structure, so leave some of those in there while we take it to the next phase and mix all this junk together. Okay, does that make sense? Now, some whites, if not many whites, actually may leave the stem on altogether. And I really don't know how many white wines do this, but just know for now, like for white wine production, it's slightly different in that white skin grapes, obviously, have no color. And if they have no color, okay, they also don't have any tannic component or tannic structure. Or not, they have a little, but not very much, not anywhere near how much the reds have. So if a winemaker wants to beef up his white wine, wants to give it a little more oomph, a little more backbone, tannic backbone, they can leave the whole cluster on when they take it to go press it. And they will smash up some of the stems in there and integrate in some of those tannic components, maybe some of those other flavors as well. So the stems and stalks are left on for white grape processing to add tannic structure, perhaps, and some flavor. But they also do another thing, and that is, I'm getting ready to jump to pressing the grapes, but what they will do is when you start to press tons and tons and tons of these suckers in a machine, and I'm just going to pick on a machine and say it's 2 plates that are just smashing these together to get all the juice out. Eventually you end up with, in the middle with what's called Pomace, P-O-M-A-C-E. And that is this big cluster of matted together grape skins and seeds and junk. Now, I'm just doing it in my hands, and I would have a big handful of this junk. Now, imagine a machine the size of this room that's pushing together 10 or 20 tons of grapes. All of that stuff, all that particulate mass smashed together, they might leave the stems in there intentionally to act as a kind of a conduit or a buffer or that create structure so that when you smash the stuff together, it will create some channels within that block of pumice that will allow juice to drip out. So there's a couple different reasons why we do it slightly. The destemming process is slightly different from reds to whites, and I've given you a bit of background of why exactly you would do certain things in certain ways. Okay? But that brings us to the pressing itself. We got to get the juice out now. So whether you've destemmed or not, you definitely crushed. All the grapes get crushed. Now you can put them in a bucket and stomp out the juice, but that's not really practical anymore from a labor standpoint and not to scale, any kind of scales of economics or scales of production. You can't have people sitting around stomping on stuff. But let's say we just want to maximize juice. If that's what the game is maximizing juice with the minimum amount of labor, why not put it in a blender? Stick this whole sucker in a blender. You'll get the max amount of juice. Or just put it in a hydraulic press that put it at 10,000 PSI and smash it into oblivion. Yes, you would get the maximum amount of juice, but now we're back to, no, you can't do that. You're going to smash up all of the stems. We don't want that. Maybe not some tannic component, but we don't want them smashed in. And if you smash the seeds, you're kaput. That's not going to be made into what we call table wine. In today's world, we use a whole lot of mechanical devices that are tweaked to the max to press out grape juice and to press it out exactly at the pressure that the winemaker wants at certain times of the winemaking process. And there are many different types of presses, by the way. I won't go through all of them, but there's a kind of a classic one called the basket press that was invented, I don't know, 1,000 years ago, and has not really changed in 1,000 years. That's when you know you got some solid technology, when you can't improve it. So a basket press is, imagine just like a wine barrel, but blown up, exploded out to the size of a room, and so it's wooden slats with gaps in between them, about, waist high or chest high, and it's a room, and you put in your 10 or 20 tons of grapes, and then you have a big plate that just comes down and smashes it from the top. Either a hydraulic that's, hydraulically pushed, it smashes the grapes, and then all the juice runs out the sides of the basket. Or even back in the old days, you'd have a screw turn on it. Just get up there and wrench it down. So that device has been around forever. There's also a horizontal screw. So imagine if you take like a tube, a long tube, again, the size of a room, 10 or 15 foot long, and have the plates coming from the sides. The whole thing is like a stainless steel tube that you could put your upper body into, and it's like a colander, so it's slotted. It has holes in it, and that's because you pile all the grapes in the middle, then you have two plates coming from either side that smash, and it pushes all the juice out, right? Then there's another one that I believe is the soup du jour for most winemaking, and that is the bladder press. And it's this kind of the same design as a horizontal press, this tube, a cylinder, but instead of smashing it together with plates to get the juice out, you actually have a bladder inside of it. Just consider it a balloon. So you have a gigantic balloon in the middle of it, and it's super awesome because you can really precisely control the PSI, how much pressure you want to put on those already crushed grapes to push the juice out of them, right? And it's also awesome, and again, it's kind of like a stainless steel colander that you strain spaghetti in, slotted, so the balloon's in the middle, you load all the fruit in, and the bladder presses are also super awesome because you can rotate it, you can turn it. Just like your washing and drying machine. So you wash your clothes, you put it in a dryer, and the dryer rotates. That's kind of what these bladder presses do. It rotates, so it evenly distributes. Just like your clothes, you evenly distribute them so they dry evenly. This evenly distributes all the grapes around it, and it's moving as it's pressing. You're inflating the balloon, pushing out all the juice. So the grapes get layered more evenly so that all the pomace doesn't chunk up in one place and cause problems with juice flow, right? Just like you drying your clothes. So why do we spend so much attention on the exact amounts of pressure applied to these grapes? Because there are different pressings of the grape too. I know you hate it. I'm giving you all this nuanced look at how wine is made. It helps you understand why there's great wines and why there's average wines. They will press the grapes at different levels to extract different things from different parts of the grape itself. Oh, intense. Why is that? Well, that's because there's different zones of the grape, as this graphic is showing you. And there's the central zone, which is kind of a tougher jelly that's right around where the seeds or pips are located, right in the middle. Then there's that intermediate zone, where there's the maximum amount of kind of what we call pulp or even jelly. I mean, if you popped open a grape or eat a grape, it's kind of squishy. It's kind of like jelly, fibrous jelly. And in the intermediate middle zone is where you have the bulk of your tartaric acid and sugars. And then there's the peripheral zone, that layer just underneath the skin that's a little tougher than the pulp. And you have all the color, a lot of tannins, astringencies, and other things that are in that zone. Now, you want to press and get things out of each zones at different times. You don't want to just completely mash. Yes, you're trying to get the maximum amount of juice, but you're not doing it as quickly as possible. You want to do it as controlled as possible. So how does this work? Well, here are some numbers and some food for thought that I want you to pick up on and understand. As I've been talking about this entire process of moving grapes from the vineyard, to crushing them, to destemming them, to sorting them on a table, there's juice everywhere, as I've now suggested. So juice has been flowing this whole time, and every step of the process, we're further manipulating and smashing and moving the berries. They're continuing to get mushed up. And even at this point, you could, for red wines, because they have the skins and the pulp and the juice all together, they can even, with fire hoses, they link it up and just pressurize and push it around like a big Slurpee machine. So the reason I'm telling you this is, before we even get to the pressing, put it in your brain, most juice comes out naturally. Before you even press the grapes, it's already been dripping everywhere. Something on the order of 50, let's call it 60 or 70% of the juice that will be used to get turned into wine is what we call free run. You've not even applied pressure, you've not pressed it, it's just dripping out everywhere. Free run, 60 or 70%, which means, and a winemaker can and usually does, take that free run juice and puts it over here in a tank or a vat or a barrel or whatever to produce that into wine. That's their free run juice. Now they'll take the rest of the slurry to press out the rest of the juice they can get. Because they're not going to be satisfied with just 60 or 70% of the juice. They want 100%. This is an agricultural commodity. You got to make money, so you want to get all the juice out. But that free run juice has the I believe, the highest amounts of sugars and the least amount of manipulation and the good balance that you pick those grapes for at that certain time. Everything else you're going to have to wrench down a little bit and force it out of those different zones of the grape that I just showed you. And they're going to have a different composition than the free run juice. Okay? So in the first pressing, in the first and second pressing, by the way, is where you get the other 30, 35, 40% of your juice. Okay? Is pressing it once or twice. And that first pressing is where you push out most of the rest of that pulp juice from that intermediate zone. And you might take that and separate it and put that in a different tank. Or then you go on to your second pressing and you apply a little more pressure. And you're going to now push stuff out of the interior zone and maybe a little bit from the peripheral zone underneath the skins. And you may put that into another batch and ferment it separately. Because the harder you press, the more tannins are extracted. Yes, you're getting sugars and the other stuff you want, but the harder you press, the more tannins and other chemicals are being extracted. And there's increasingly less and less and less sugars left, okay? So continued pressings are structurally, chemically different from the free run, meaning they typically have lower sugars, I would assume lower sugars overall, lower acids, higher pH, and a higher tannic component. Now, why would they do this? Are they doing it because free is awesome, free press is awesome, free run juice is great, and it's just the best? Maybe, and maybe they just ferment that, put it in a bottle and say it's 100% free run. I've not seen too many people market wines that way. It's actually more because you can use those different batches as a tool in your toolkit when you are blending your final wine. Meaning, you have fermented your 70% of your juice, free run is over here fermenting. That's your bulk, okay? That's the main deal. But you also have your first and second pressings over here that are a bit more tannic, a bit more other things going on. At the end of the day, after you fermented this stuff out, the winemaker can now say, okay, well, here's the free run stuff. I'd like to boost it up a little. I think it's lacking a little tannic component. Let's go over to the other batch, the first and second pressing batches, and add in. I mean, again, they might just say, no, the free run fermented juice is fine, bottle it. But they have tools at their disposal to integrate back in and make a balanced finished wine. Right. Now, I said there's first, second, third, maybe fifth pressing for all I know. Really, when you get to the third pressing and beyond, you're really mashing the living hell out of the rest of that pomace. And pomace, this is, again, the leftover seeds, stalks, skins. Usually, it's used for fertilizer. You put it back out into the fields. Recycling. Bio-happiness. However, you could continue to press that pomace, obliterate that pomace, and then put maybe the whole pomace, but it's certainly the juice you got from it, into a separate batch that you can then make into something that's not quite wine. Now, it technically is, but once you get to a third pressing, you're getting super bitter tannic extractions and maybe some sugars, enough sugars to ferment into some alcohol, but also you're breaking the seeds, so now you're imparting all kinds of tannic bitterness and other chemicals. So have you ever had a wine that tastes like that? No, you haven't. But if anybody's ever had grappa from Italy, they call it Mar in France, M-A-R-C in France, and grappa in Italy. Those are actually wine, grape brandies, I should say. So you take the rest of the pomace and blend it, smash it, and then ferment it, maybe even with the pomace in there to extract as much of the sugars out, every ounce of sugar out of there. And so you have some sort of base alcohol, but it's nasty. So what you do is then distill it into a liquor. And if you've ever had grappa or Mar, you know what I'm talking about. It's quite unforgettable flavor because it's liquor, it's high-test liquor. Think of it like moonshine, but because they've broken up the seeds and the stems and the stalks, it has intense bitterness that translates all the way through the winemaking process to the distillation process to make it into a liquor. So that's where you get grappa and Mar from. Sorry, you know I go off on tangents here, there, and everywhere, but I think you probably like this stuff. But let's get back to the juice, okay? We have other pressing matters to get to. Pressing right? Let's get back to pressing. Pressed juice. Oh man, I'm terrible. Pressed juice, as I've now suggested, usually kept separate from the free run, reused to reblend later to achieve desired balance in a finished wine. Now I'm going to give you some details of what the difference between white wine production, white grape white wine production, and red grape red wine production is. And that is for the processes I've talked about so far. When you have these white grapes come into the winery, okay, you're going to crush them and press them in fairly short order. Bring them in, crush them, possibly destem them, maybe not, but either way, they're going right in a row, straight to the presser, get the juice out. Why? Because the skins don't have that much to offer us. We don't need to let them hang out. And we're going to go ahead and get the stems out of there because it's the juice we want. We want the white grape juice to then turn it into wine. With red grapes, hold the phone. These will be crushed, destemmed, but not pressed. So, crushed and pressed, crushed, not pressed yet, right? Crushed, destemmed, sorted even, maybe another sorting process on the berries, but pressing for red grapes doesn't occur actually until the end of the primary fermentation. Now I know I'm jumping ahead, but I do want you to understand it. Whoa, you're not just extracting all the juice out of all grapes as they come in. Because, as we pointed out, the red skins are crucial to the development of the color and flavor of red wine. So you want skin contact. You want that stuff to hang out there with the juice. So pull it into the vineyard, pull it into the winery, crush it, destem it, maybe sort it once or twice. And now, getting back to the Slurpee hose, now you have big hoses that are running this slurry. And that's the good word to use. It's like a slurry, a slushy grape slurry of juice and skins, and the seeds are still in there too because you can't separate them out any good way. And they can just hook up the hoses and push it into a fermenting tank somewhere else, and they'll leave that whole slushy junk combination in there to leach out colors and tannins and other phenolics from the skin, okay? They're not going to press that till later, and I'll get to that later in the next lecture. Either way, we're almost now ready to ferment. Be it white grape juice or red grape must. We're almost ready to ferment it, but before we do that, let's kill it. What? No, kill it. I like organic and I'm bio-friendly. I recycle. Yeah, I hesitated to even bring this up because I'm not trying to offend any sensibilities of winemakers or tell you any insider trade secrets, but you know me, I'm all about the knowledge. And I want you to have the knowledge. So we, the winemakers, we're going to kill this juice as much as we can. We're gonna decimate it. We're gonna napalm this sucker. before we actually take it to fermentation. Okay, why? Well, maybe you've already gotten the answer to this formulated in your head from the last 50 minutes of me talking. Back to the microbes. Naturally, out in the field, yeast are all over these grapes already, but they're wild yeast. We don't know what yeast they are, and there's hundreds of different varieties. We don't know what they're going to do. And there's also bacteria, especially one called Acetobacter, or Acetobacteria. And Acetobacteria is the bacteria that eats alcohol and turns it into vinegar, acetic acid. Those things are floating around, along with funguses, molds, and viruses, and all this other stuff. Mostly we're focused on the Acetobacteria and other yeast that we don't know. Now that we've gone through this whole process, and this is happening mostly in open air, by the way. This isn't some massively sterile environment. Go visit a winery. It's a big warehouse. So stuff's floating around. So there's even more stuff being introduced. And during all the steps I've now talked about for 50 minutes, there's stuff floating in and out, but also fermentation is occurring. Because again, there's natural yeast already there. And if the yeast are already there making alcohol, the Acetobacteria is already there, already starting to eat the alcohol. So you already have processes happening that you are not controlling. And the winemaker doesn't want that. So you can do a couple things really quickly or at the same time. And that is you can refrigerate. And like I said, you can't process all your wines at the exact same time if all the grapes get harvested. So you may put it in a reefer truck or a refrigerator, even in juice form. But either way, you're probably going to kill it. And this is for reds and whites and all colored wines in between. How do we kill microbiological activity in a grape slushy or white juice? During the pressing process, I left this out intentionally to wrap it up here at the end. During the pressing process, many of these machines I'm talking about, they're like closed containers, okay? They're a closed loop system. So you put it in there and it's kind of airtight. And what you can do during the pressing process, or maybe you can just charge it, a big vat with this stuff. But either way, you want to introduce SO2 to the equation. That's sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide is used in the pressing process. It's actually used in the vineyards, by the way. I think there's a whole lot of different viticulture applications that use powdered sulfur in different mixtures to cure crop diseases and not just grape. Sulfur is awesome, and here's why. Sulfur kills everything. So when we're getting to this part of the process, we want to kill everything to start to stabilize it. And sulfur dioxide is pumped into during the pressing process. And I am not a winemaker. I've been to lots of different wineries, and all these processes, by the way, they also do differently in different wineries. Not everybody has the same equipment. Not everybody introduces SO2 the exact same way. I guess you could sprinkle it into the vat, although I kind of doubt it. I guess you can make it into a liquid format and mix it in with the juice, although I doubt it. It's mostly a gas. And consider it much like CO2, carbon dioxide. This is sulfur dioxide. So imagine if you have a big, syrupy, goopy, sweet liquid, and you introduce CO2 to it, right? You charge it in there, and under pressure, you charge this syrup with CO2. That makes bubbles in champagne and soda. And that's what you've done when you have a big, gloopy, sweet liquid that you introduce bubbles to. That's called Coca-Cola, okay? Imagine doing the same thing to your white grape juice or your red grape must slushy and introducing this SO2 to it. It doesn't create bubbles. It actually permeates it under pressure, and then when you release the pressure, it just blows off, okay? But this stuff is lethal. So it stops all microbiological activity, and that's exactly what you want to do. Again, does it sound all happy, happy, organic, nicey? No, but sulfur has been used for centuries, if not millennia, for just such processes. And sulfur is used to sterilize all manner of things in all manner of places, especially in the winemaking process. Sulfur is used to sterilize barrels. Sadly, sulfur is probably used to sterilize the winery equipment. So it's not that unheard of. It's not radical. It's not that big a deal, honestly. It's a cleaner. It's a semi-organic cleaner that's really good at killing microbes. Now, that I think is not widely advertised when you hear people talk about how they make wine, and if you go to a winery, they probably won't tell you that because of this big fear of, oh, this wine contains sulfites. So the next question you're going to ask is, oh boy, does that mean that's where the sulfites get into the wine? Maybe. It's a gas though, so it kind of dissipates. Sulfites are created naturally in wines through the fermentation process, but yes, because of sulfur being used in different processes that I've now touched upon, yeah, that must introduce some as well. Are there completely organic, don't use any SO2 wines produced? Sure. France produces a lot. I'm sure that the rage against sulfites has influenced a lot of winemakers to be like, no, we're not going to use SO2. But if they don't, they're going to have to do something to calm down their juice, because there is all sorts of activity happening that they're not controlling unless they've stabilized the juice before you even start your proper fermentation. Does that make sense? And again, you can kind of stabilize by freezing it, by pasteurizing it. You can do lots of stuff to liquids to kill microbes, but boiling your grape juice before you make it into wine is very destructive. Freezing it is not terribly good either. So these chemical alternatives have been in practice for a long time, and they just are what they are. And that's why they're used. And now, my friends, we either have some white grape juice from white grapes. Oh, by the way, you could have white grape juice from red grapes. Right? You can have a white Merlot. So we got some white grape juice or some red grape must, slurry slushy, that now is biologically dead because we've dosed it with SO2. And now we're going to move that into a tank, into another vessel, and we're going to start this process called fermentation. But before we get to the ferment itself, I keep saying white grape juice or red grape must. We must now consider the must, because the must is how we get different colored juice and therefore different colored wines to begin with. So must we consider must for a moment? Yes, we must, and on to must we shall go.